As you build your applications, obviously you want to build them in such a way that you're taking advantage of performance and scalability. You want to write efficient code. You want to write your code such that it can be scaled out. But you're also obviously reliant on the platform that your code is running on. And we're looking at ASP.NET as one of the primary code hosting frameworks that you'll find in Azure. And we're talking about a system that is over 15 years old. So and that doesn't mean statically, it has evolved over 15 years. And we've seen a lot of improvements to this framework over the years. And there were some pretty major improvements that were made actually back in 2012 with the advent of the ASP.NET 4.5 framework. We want to talk about some of these just so you're aware of them as you're building, and if you're planning on building and hosting web applications or even web-based services that are running on top of ASP.NET in the Azure environment, or frankly, even if you're doing it in an on-premises environment. So let's talk about that. All right. So what are some of the things? And the first two things are actually related to each other, and that is the idea of asynchronous processing within your web application. Now, I will be honest with you, when I first saw this, my first thought was, well, it's already by and large asynchronous anyways because it's handling multiple requests. And that's how IIS works. But then as I looked into it and saw, okay, it kind of makes sense because if I've got a request that comes into the web server and my request then has maybe a service call and there's a long wait period on that service call, that's still a thread that's being held up that doesn't need to be, that could potentially be used to handle other requests. And so by that, we have this ability to run things asynchronously. We're going to talk about that a little bit more and actually demonstrate that as well. I think that both in terms of the basic asynchronous request and response and support for the TPL, the Task Parallel Library, very important concepts. And by the way, if you're not a huge fan of writing very complex asynchronous code, another thing that was added to the framework in general into ASP.NET to make asynchronous code much easier to write and maintain is the await and async syntax that we're going to take a look at. All right, other things that we have within ASP.NET 4.5, ASP.NET 4.5, excuse me, is sharing common assemblies across applications, right? And so, if you've got shared assemblies now, rather than having a copy of that load up with each application, they can actually load a single, or ASP.NET will load a single instance of that library, and it's going to put pointer code in the application code that it compiles and has in memory, so that I have multiple applications sharing the same libraries. It can give me more efficiency in terms of load time and memory usage, both of which are very important for large-scale applications, obviously. Other things that you've got multi-core startup with just-in-time compilation. So what that means is if you've got the multi-processor core machines and you're starting up an ASP.NET web application and it needs to just-in-time compile, that compilation process can now be spread out across multiple cores, making that startup process potentially significantly faster, and that can be a big deal. Now there's other things to deal with that, such as the always-on capability that we talked about in an earlier module. All right, we also have something called the prefetcher. Now the prefetcher is something that's been built into Windows that looks at patterns of usage so that when you start up Windows, it can automatically in the background start up applications that Windows expects you to use. You can actually do the same thing with IIS, although it is done via configuration files. When you say, okay, when IIS starts up, I want to make sure that it goes ahead and starts up these web applications, prefetches these pages so that when somebody comes in, that's already going to be preloaded and it's going to be much more efficient. Right? And so there's a lot of things that are built in at a low level to ASP.NET 4.5. Some of these are going to be automatic, such as the multi-core startup. Some of these are going to be things that you're going to want to consider building into your application, such as the asynchronous processing, the asynchronous request handling, the task parallel library, etc.